March 15, 2024. Daniel Way had never walked off a set in 40 years. Not for broken ribs, not for concussions, not even when they told him his insurance was canceled. But when the 11-year-old girl in the hospital bed whispered, "Uncle Tommy says you still blame yourself for the rain that night," Daniel's world stopped. Tommy Chen died in 1994, 30 years ago, in a car crash Daniel caused but walked away from. The crew watched their action hero, a man who jumped off buildings and fought armies, crumble to his knees beside a dying child's bed. What happened next became the most talked-about moment in film industry history, because Emma Chen knew things about that night that were impossible to know. Things that would either destroy Daniel Way forever or finally set him free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence in the pediatric ward stretched like a taut wire. Daniel remained frozen on his knees beside Emma's bed, his weathered hands gripping the metal rail so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The child's words echoed in his skull. "Uncle Tommy says you still blame yourself for the rain that night." Behind him, the film crew shuffled uncomfortably. Director Sarah Martinez had followed them to the hospital for what was supposed to be a 15-minute publicity visit, a quick photo op with a terminally ill fan before they wrapped filming on Dragon's Last Stand. Now her cameras captured something entirely different, Hong Kong's most legendary action star looking like he'd seen a ghost, because he had. Emma Chen lay propped against cartoon-printed pillows, her bald head covered by a knitted beanie decorated with pandas. Leukemia had taken her hair, her strength, and according to the doctors, would take her life within weeks. But her dark eyes held an impossible clarity as she studied Daniel's face. "You don't remember me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beep of monitors. "But I remember you. From before." Daniel's throat felt like sandpaper. "Before what?" "Before I got sick. Before I came back." Emma's small hand found his. Her skin was paper-thin, translucent veins mapping delicate pathways beneath the surface. "Tommy wanted me to tell you something." The room tilted. Daniel had built his career on controlling his body through impossible situations, hanging from helicopters, fighting on collapsing bridges, surviving explosions that would kill ordinary men. But this 11-year-old girl had just spoken his dead best friend's name, and he couldn't even remember how to breathe. "How do you know that name?" The question came out as a croak. Emma smiled, and for a terrifying moment, Daniel saw something familiar in her expression. Something that reminded him of late nights in Hong Kong, planning stunts that everyone said were too dangerous, with a young man who laughed at death until death stopped laughing back. "He talks about you all the time," Emma said, "about the movies you made together, about how you taught him to fall without breaking his bones, about how much he misses egg waffles from the night market." The monitors around Emma's bed began beeping faster. A nurse materialized at Daniel's elbow, checking readouts with practiced efficiency. "She needs rest," the woman said firmly. "The visit should end soon." But Emma tightened her grip on Daniel's hand with surprising strength. "The rain wasn't your fault," she continued, ignoring the nurse. "He knows you think it was. He knows you see his face every time you do a car chase scene. But the brakes were already cut. Someone wanted you dead that night, not him." Daniel's vision blurred. The pediatric ward around him, the cheerful murals, the scattered toys, the antiseptic smell, faded until there was only this impossible child and her impossible words. Words that carved open a wound he'd spent 30 years trying to heal. March 23, 1994. A mountain road outside Hong Kong. Rain turning asphalt into glass. Daniel behind the wheel of the hero car, Tommy doubling for the villain in the chase vehicle behind him, a stunt they'd rehearsed a dozen times in perfect weather. But that night, when Daniel hit his mark and slammed the brakes for Tommy's car to spin past him, nothing happened. The pedal went straight to the floor. Daniel's car plowed through the safety barrier and tumbled down the mountainside while Tommy, following their choreography perfectly, sent his vehicle through the gap where Daniel should have stopped. Tommy Chen died on impact. Daniel Way walked away with a dislocated shoulder and 30 years of survivor's guilt. "Nobody knew about the brakes," Daniel whispered. The investigation said mechanical failure. Rain, Driver error. Tommy says someone paid the mechanic, Emma replied. Someone who wanted to hurt you. But they got him instead, and the mechanic died 6 months later. Heart attack. Except Tommy saw what really happened to him. The nurse was speaking urgently to Dr. Patel now, gesturing toward Emma's monitors. The film crew exchanged confused glances. Sarah Martinez had stopped filming entirely, her camera hanging useless at her side. Daniel stared into Emma's eyes and saw something that made his blood freeze. For just a moment, her features seemed to shift, shadows playing tricks with bone structure and expression. For just a moment, she looked like someone else entirely, someone he'd watched die 30 years ago. How? The word barely escaped his lips. Emma's breathing was getting shallower, but she managed another smile. Some people get to come back, she said, when there's something important left undone, when someone they love is in danger. The machines around her bed erupted in urgent alarms. Dr. Patel rushed in with a crash cart as nurses cleared the room. Daniel found himself pushed into the hallway, his crew gathering around him with questions he couldn't begin to answer. Through the chaos, Emma's voice reached him one last time. Room 247 tomorrow at midnight. Come alone. Tommy has something to show you. Then the door slammed shut, leaving Daniel Way, a man who had never believed in anything he couldn't punch, staring at the impossible. The hospital corridor felt like a fever dream. Daniel stood frozen outside Emma's room, watching through the small window as medical staff worked over her small form. The urgent beeping of machines created a rhythm that matched his hammering pulse. His crew clustered around him, grips, gaffers, and production assistants who'd followed him here expecting a simple publicity stop. Now they whispered among themselves, stealing glances at their legendary boss who looked like he'd aged a decade in 20 minutes. Daniel? Sarah Martinez touched his shoulder gently. The director's usual commanding presence had softened into something approaching concern. We should go. Let the doctors work. He nodded without really hearing her. Room 247 tomorrow at midnight. The words carved themselves into his consciousness like a blade. How could a dying child know about cut brake lines, about a mechanic's suspicious death, about Tommy's last name when Daniel had never mentioned it publicly, when the accident reports were buried in Hong Kong police files from 3 decades ago? The elevator ride to the parking garage passed in suffocating silence. Daniel's reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors. 58 years old, gray threading through his black hair, lines mapping every stunt that should have killed him. He'd built an empire on fearlessness, on the promise that Daniel Way never backed down from anything. But standing in that pediatric room, holding a child's fragile hand while she spoke impossible truths, he'd felt more terrified than he had since 1994. Vancouver's late afternoon rain drummed against the concrete as they reached the parking level. The sound made Daniel's hands shake. 30 years, and he still couldn't hear rain without seeing Tommy's car spinning through empty air, without hearing the crunch of metal and silence that followed. Boss? Marcus, his longtime stunt coordinator, appeared at his elbow. The younger man had worked with Daniel for 15 years, had seen him face down speeding trains and exploding buildings without flinching. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Because I have. The words stuck in Daniel's throat. Instead, he managed, just tired, long day. Sarah wasn't buying it. She directed 4 of his films, had learned to read his moods like weather patterns. That little girl really got to you. What she said about your friend? Drop it. The words came out harder than Daniel intended. Sarah stepped back, surprise flickering across her features. He forced his voice gentler. Please, I need some air. The crew exchanged glances but began dispersing toward their rental cars. Only Marcus lingered, loyal as a guard dog. Want me to drive you back to the hotel? Daniel shook his head. I'll walk. The rain had intensified by the time he reached the street. Vancouver's downtown core stretched before him, all glass towers and reflected neon bleeding across wet pavement. He'd filmed in dozens of cities over the decades, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Los Angeles, Sydney, but they all looked the same when viewed through the lens of memory. All became that mountain road outside Hong Kong, rain turning asphalt treacherous, Tommy's laughter echoing from the radio before everything went wrong. His hotel suite overlooked English Bay. Daniel stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching ferries cut through gray water while the city sparkled below. The space felt cavernous: king bed, marble bathroom, sitting area that could host a small party. All the luxuries success could buy, and all of it meaningless when weighed against the memory of a friend's broken body. The phone rang. Daniel's assistant, probably, or his manager calling from Hong Kong about the film's completion schedule. He let it go to voicemail. On the coffee table, tomorrow's call sheets lay spread like tarot cards, the final day of shooting for what he'd announced would be his last film. After 35 years of broken bones and close calls, Daniel Way was ready to retire, or he had been, until a dying child spoke his dead friend's name. The minibar held a selection of expensive whiskey. Daniel poured 3 fingers of Macallan and settled into the leather armchair. The alcohol burned, but it didn't touch the chill that had settled in his bones since leaving the hospital. Some people get to come back when there's something important left undone. Emma's words haunted him. In all his years of Buddhist temple visits with his grandmother, all the incense burned for Tommy's spirit. Daniel had never truly believed in anything beyond the physical world. Death was death. The past was past. Ghosts were special effects and wire work. But Emma Chen had looked at him with eyes that held impossible knowledge. Had spoken in Tommy's voice about things only Tommy could know. Outside, the rain continued falling, each drop against the window like a countdown to midnight, to room 247, to answers that Daniel wasn't sure he was brave enough to hear. He closed his eyes and tried to forget the way Emma's face had shifted in the hospital room shadows. Tried to forget how, for just a moment, she'd looked exactly like the friend he'd failed to save. Tomorrow would come whether he was ready or not. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The whiskey glass had slipped from his fingers, amber liquid spreading across the marble floor like spilled blood. The rain had stopped, leaving Vancouver's night unnaturally quiet beyond the windows. His phone buzzed insistently on the coffee table, a text message lighting up the screen at 11:47 p.m. Room 247. Don't keep me waiting. T. The phone trembled in Daniel's grip. The message had come from an unknown number, but that single letter signature made his vision blur. T. Tommy had signed every note that way during their years working together. Quick messages about script changes, stunt modifications, late-night plans to grab noodles after 18-hour shooting days. But Tommy had been dead for 30 years. Daniel's fingers moved without conscious thought, scrolling through his contacts to find Dr. Patel's number. The pediatrician had given him her direct line after Emma's episode, promising to call if the girl's condition changed. But when he dialed, it went straight to voicemail. The hotel elevator descended through floors of sleeping guests while Daniel's reflection fractured in the polished doors. He'd thrown on yesterday's clothes, jeans, a black t-shirt that still smelled faintly of the hospital's antiseptic air. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. 35 years of death-defying stunts, and he was terrified of an 11-year-old girl with leukemia. The hospital's night shift moved with subdued efficiency. Fewer staff, dimmed lighting, the kind of hushed atmosphere that made every footstep echo. Daniel signed in at the visitor's desk, his signature looking foreign and shaky. The security guard barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle. The pediatric ward felt different at night. The cheerful murals looked sinister in the reduced lighting. Cartoon animals transformed into lurking shadows. Room 245, room 246. Daniel's steps slowed as he approached Emma's door, his pulse thundering in his ears. Room 247 stood slightly ajar, pale light spilling into the hallway. No sound of monitors, no hushed voices of medical staff, just silence that felt thick as water. Daniel pushed the door open. Emma sat upright in her hospital bed, but everything about her had changed. Her skin no longer carried the translucent pallor of terminal illness. Her eyes held a sharp awareness that belonged to someone far older than 11. Most unnervingly, she was smiling with an expression Daniel recognized from 1,000 shared memories. "You came," she said, and her voice carried an accent that made Daniel's knees weak. Hong Kong inflection. The same cadence Tommy had used when speaking English, vowels shaped by a childhood in Kowloon. This isn't possible. The words scraped Daniel's throat raw. Emma, or whatever Emma had become, tilted her head with Tommy's characteristic gesture. Remember when we filmed that rooftop chase in '92? You said the same thing when I jumped between those buildings. This isn't possible, Tommy. The distance is too far. But I made it anyway. Daniel gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. The memory was perfect, complete. Tommy launching himself across a 15-foot gap while cameras rolled. Daniel's heart stopping until his friend landed safely on the opposite building. They'd never put that conversation in any interview, any behind-the-scenes footage. It had been private, just two friends pushing the boundaries of what the human body could survive. "Show me your hands," Emma said quietly. Without thinking, Daniel extended his arms. Emma reached out and traced a scar on his left palm, a thin white line from a stunt gone wrong during their third film together. Her touch was ice cold, but her fingers found the mark with impossible precision. "Glass from the motorcycle crash in Streets of Fire," she said. "You made me promise never to tell the insurance company. It was because you insisted on doing the stunt without gloves. You said the grip felt wrong with protection." Emma's eyes met his. "I kept that promise even after I died." The room spun around Daniel like a carnival ride breaking free from its axis. This child knew details that existed nowhere but in his memory. Secrets he'd carried alone for decades, conversations he'd shared with no one after Tommy's death. Why? The question came out as a whisper. Why now? Why her? Emma's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like herself again, a sick child fighting a disease that would claim her life. But when she spoke, Tommy's voice emerged from her lips. "Because someone's coming for you, Danny. The same people who cut my brakes. They know you've been asking questions, stirring up old ghosts. And this time, they won't miss." The hospital room faded around them until there was only Emma's face, pale as moonlight, and words that shattered the last 30 years of Daniel's carefully constructed reality. He'd spent 3 decades believing Tommy's death was an accident, a cruel twist of fate and failing machinery. But cut brakes meant murder, meant someone had wanted him dead and killed his best friend instead. Who? Daniel's voice broke on the word. Emma smiled one last time before her eyes rolled back and she collapsed against her pillows. The monitors erupted in urgent alarms as nurses flooded the room, pushing Daniel aside as they fought to save a dying child. But the message had been delivered. The past had returned with a vengeance, and Daniel Way's world would never be the same. The chaos lasted 17 minutes. Daniel counted each second while nurses worked over Emma's still form, pumping medications through her 4, adjusting ventilator settings, speaking in the clipped language of medical crisis. When her vitals finally stabilized, they found him still standing in the corner like a statue, staring at nothing. "Sir?" Dr. Patel materialized beside him, her scrubs wrinkled from being called in at 1 a.m. "You need to leave. Now." Daniel nodded without comprehension. His legs moved automatically, carrying him through corridors that seemed to stretch infinitely. Behind him, he heard Dr. Patel speaking urgently to the night supervisor. Fragments of conversation drifting like smoke. Shouldn't have been possible for her to be conscious. Sedation levels were. How did he get in here? The hotel room felt like a tomb. Daniel sat on the bed's edge, holding his phone, thumb hovering over contacts he hadn't called in years. Who did you tell when the impossible crashed into your life like a speeding car? Who believed that a dying child could channel your dead best friend's voice, could know secrets buried deeper than any grave? The rain had returned, drumming against windows with increasing urgency. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to think rationally. Hallucination, stress-induced breakdown, medical emergency causing him to project familiar voices onto a sick child's delirium. Anything except the truth his bones recognized, but his mind rejected. "Someone's coming for you, Danny." His phone rang at 2:47 a.m., unknown number. Daniel stared at the screen until voicemail picked up, then played the message with trembling fingers. Silence. Then, barely audible, the mechanic's name was William Siu. The line went dead. Daniel's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the phone. William Siu had been found dead in his Kowloon apartment 6 months after the crash, massive heart attack at 34. No previous cardiac issues, no family history. Daniel remembered reading the obituary, feeling hollow sympathy for another life cut short too soon. Except according to Emma, according to Tommy, It hadn't been natural causes. Daniel's laptop sat closed on the desk, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. Couldn't start searching for connections he'd been blind to for 30 years. Because investigating meant accepting that everything he'd believed about that night was wrong. That Tommy hadn't died because of Daniel's choice to do the stunt in dangerous weather. That someone had murdered his best friend while targeting him. That the same someone might still be out there. Sleep came in fragments haunted by whispered conversations. Daniel jolted awake every hour to phantom phone calls, to shadows moving past his windows, to the sound of Emma's voice speaking words that couldn't be real. By dawn, he'd given up pretending rest was possible. The film set buzzed with typical final day energy when Daniel arrived, cast and crew preparing for the last shots of Blood and Thunder, his announced farewell to action cinema. But the atmosphere felt different as he moved through the organized chaos. Conversations stopped when he passed. Crew members who'd worked with him for years avoided eye contact, whispering among themselves like mourners at a funeral. Daniel. Sarah Martinez intercepted him near the catering truck, her expression carefully neutral. "We need to talk." She led him to her director's chair, isolated from the main crew. Vancouver's morning fog rolled between the downtown buildings they were using for location shots, turning the world gray and insubstantial. "I got calls this morning," Sarah said without preamble. 3 of them. People asking about yesterday, about what happened at the hospital. Daniel's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "What kind of people?" "The kind who don't give names but know which hotel you're staying in. Which room." Sarah's voice carried an edge he'd never heard before. "The kind who ask very specific questions about your conversations with the sick girl." The fog suddenly felt suffocating. Daniel scanned the crew, looking for faces that didn't belong, for the watchers Tommy had warned about. But everyone looked exactly as they should, except for the fear in their eyes when they glanced his direction. "What did you tell them?" Daniel's voice came out steadier than he felt. "Nothing. There was nothing to tell." Sarah leaned closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "But Daniel, one of them knew things. About your early films. About people you worked with who died. About accidents that maybe weren't accidents." The coffee cup slipped from Daniel's nerveless fingers, shattering against concrete. Dark liquid spread across gray stone like blood. And suddenly he was back on that mountain road, watching Tommy's car spin through empty air while rain turned the world into a nightmare. Sarah was still talking, but her words faded beneath the memory of monitors flattening and Emma's impossible smile. Daniel Way had spent 30 years running from ghosts, building walls of fame and success to keep the past buried. But the dead, it seemed, had finally caught up with him. The broken coffee cup lay in fragments at Daniel's feet, each shard reflecting his fractured world back at him. Sarah's voice became distant thunder as the implications crashed over him like a collapsing building. Not just Tommy. Other people who died. Accidents that maybe weren't accidents. Who else? Daniel's whisper cut through Sarah's concerned rambling. She blinked, startled by the raw desperation in his voice. "What? You said they asked about other people who died. Who else, Sarah?" The fog seemed to press closer as Sarah studied his face. Whatever she saw there made her take a step back. "Daniel, what aren't you telling me?" These weren't casual questions. They had names, dates, details about who else. He grabbed her arm, fingers digging into her jacket. Several crew members turned at the sharp edge in his voice. "Let go." Sarah's tone went ice cold. "You're scaring me." Daniel released her, but his hands continued shaking. Around them, the film set had taken on a surreal quality. Familiar faces now potential threats. Ordinary equipment transformed into watching eyes. The career he'd built on fearless precision was crumbling with each revelation, each impossible truth Emma had whispered in that sterile room. "Wei Min," Sarah said finally, her voice barely audible. "The assistant director from your early Hong Kong films. Died in that apartment fire in '96, remember? And there was a stunt woman, Lynn something. Car accident in Macau, maybe '98? Daniel, why do you look like—" But he was already walking away, muscle memory carrying him toward the equipment trucks while his mind reeled. Wei Min had been more than an assistant director. He'd been Tommy's cousin, had started asking questions after the crash, demanding investigations, pushing police to examine the wreckage more carefully. The fire that killed him had destroyed half a city block, ruled an electrical fault. And Lin Zhang, 23 years old, Tommy's protege, the only other person who'd been at the garage the day before Tommy died, the only other person who might have seen something suspicious about his car. The pattern Sarah's anonymous callers had recognized was finally becoming clear to Daniel, 30 years too late. Everyone who'd been close to Tommy. Everyone who might have asked dangerous questions. All dead within 4 years of the crash, all from seemingly unrelated accidents. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number, another text read Pagoda Restaurant, Chinatown. 1 hour. Come alone or more people die. Daniel stared at the message until the words blurred. Around him, the film crew continued their work. Lighting adjustments for the final scene, costume checks, the mundane mechanics of creating illusion. But he was no longer part of their world. He'd been pulled back into 1994, into the rain-soaked reality where his best friend had died because someone wanted Daniel Way silenced forever. "Boss?" Marcus appeared at his elbow, concern creasing his weathered features. "Sarah said you're not feeling well. Want me to call the medic?" The kindness in Marcus's voice nearly broke him. This man had followed Daniel through 15 years of increasingly dangerous stunts, had trusted his judgment without question, had become the closest thing to family Daniel had allowed himself since Tommy's death. Now that loyalty might get Marcus killed. "I need you to do something for me," Daniel said quietly. "All of you. Pack up. Leave Vancouver today." Marcus laughed nervously. "Come on, boss. We've got 2 more scenes to shoot. The studio will survive." Daniel met his friend's eyes, letting him see the fear there. "But you might not. Please, trust me one last time." The color drained from Marcus's face as the words registered. In all their years together, he'd never heard Daniel Way admit to being afraid of anything. The fact that he was willing to abandon his final film to keep them safe, spoke volumes about the danger circling them like sharks scenting blood. "What's happening, Daniel? The real story." Before he could answer, Sarah's scream cut through the morning air. She stood frozen beside the catering truck, cell phone pressed to her ear, face white as winter sky. The entire crew turned toward the sound, conversations dying as they recognized the particular quality of her terror. Daniel reached her first. "What is it?" "The hospital." Her voice came out in broken fragments. "Emma Chen. God, Daniel, she's gone." The fog swirled around them like grave dirt settling. Somewhere in the distance, Vancouver's city sounds continued. Traffic, construction, life proceeding, as if a child hadn't just died to deliver a dead man's warning. As if Daniel's carefully constructed reality wasn't dissolving with each passing second. But Emma's death wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was just the beginning. Someone had murdered his friend, had spent 30 years silencing witnesses, and now they were ready to finish what they'd started. The message was clear: 1 hour to get answers, or the killing would begin again. Daniel stood frozen beside Sarah, Emma's death hitting him like a physical blow. The child who had somehow channeled Tommy's voice, who had whispered impossible secrets in the darkness, gone. Just when she'd opened the door to truths he'd buried for 30 years. But as Sarah sobbed into her phone, speaking with hospital staff about next of kin and arrangements, a cold realization began forming in Daniel's chest. He pulled out his own phone with trembling fingers and dialed the pediatric ward directly. "Dr. Patel speaking. This is Daniel Way. I was visiting Emma Chen last night when she had that episode. I heard that she passed away this morning." A long pause. "Then, Mr. Way, I'm afraid there's been some confusion. Emma is very much alive. Weak, certainly, but her condition stabilized around dawn." "Who told you she was dead?" The phone slipped from Daniel's numb fingers, clattering against the concrete. Sarah spun toward him, her own call still active, and the look of dawning horror on her face told him everything he needed to know. "Sarah." His voice came out hoarse. "Who called you about Emma?" She lifted her phone, staring at the screen as if seeing it for the first time. They said they were from Vancouver General. Dr. Morrison from Pediatric Oncology." "But," her face went white. "Daniel, I never told them I knew about Emma. They called me directly, knew exactly who to ask about. The film set around them continued its routine bustle, but Daniel felt reality tilting on its axis again. This wasn't grief or coincidence. This was manipulation. Someone had wanted him to believe Emma was dead, had orchestrated Sarah's emotional breakdown to, what? Drive him toward that meeting at the Red Pagoda? Force him into panic so he'd make mistakes? Marcus appeared beside them, taking in their stricken expressions. What's going on? You both look like… We need to leave. Now. Daniel grabbed Sarah's arm, scanning the crew for faces he didn't recognize, for anyone paying too much attention to their conversation. Everyone needs to pack up and get out of Vancouver. Daniel, you're not making sense, Sarah said, but her voice carried an edge of fear. The film isn't finished. The studio contracts. Forget the contracts. Daniel's mind raced through the implications. If Emma was alive, if that phone call had been a lie, then someone had been watching them closely enough to know exactly which emotional pressure point to hit. Someone who knew about his hospital visits, about Sarah's protective instincts toward everyone on her sets. Someone who had been orchestrating this entire situation from the beginning. Oh God, he whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place. Oh God, she was never sick. The words hung in the Vancouver morning air like smoke from a building fire. Sarah stared at him in confusion, but Marcus stepped closer, his expression sharp with understanding. Boss, what are you saying? Daniel's legs felt unsteady as the full scope of the deception revealed itself. Emma Chen, the dying child who somehow knew about Tommy's crash, who could recite conversations we'd never shared with anyone. What are the odds that a terminally ill 11-year-old would know details about a 30-year-old car accident in Hong Kong? People research their heroes, Sarah said weakly. Maybe she found old interviews. There were no interviews about those details, Daniel cut her off. No articles about Tommy's last words, no behind-the-scenes footage of our private conversations. The only way she could know those things was if… He stopped, the final piece of the puzzle sliding into place with sickening clarity. If someone told her what to say, Marcus finished quietly. The fog suddenly felt oppressive, pressing against them like a living thing. Daniel pulled out his phone again, scrolling through the text messages from unknown numbers. The mechanic's name was William Siu. Information that had seemed like supernatural revelation now felt like breadcrumbs deliberately dropped to lead him down a specific path. 30 years, he said, his voice hollow with realization. They've been watching me for 30 years, waiting for the right moment. Emma wasn't channeling Tommy's spirit. She was reciting a script. Sarah's face crumpled as the implications hit her. That little girl, they used a sick child to get to you. Daniel, what kind of people are we dealing with? But Daniel wasn't focused on their cruelty anymore. He was thinking about Emma's performance in that hospital room, the way she'd known exactly which memories would devastate him most completely. The precision of her Tommy impression, right down to the accent and mannerisms. That level of detail required more than just research. It required someone who had been there. Someone who had known Tommy personally, intimately. Someone Daniel had trusted completely, and who had betrayed them both. The anonymous text about the Red Pagoda restaurant suddenly felt less like a threat and more like an invitation to finally meet his oldest enemy face to face. Daniel stared at his phone screen, the anonymous message burning into his retinas. Red Pagoda restaurant, Chinatown, 1 hour. But now, with the truth about Emma's manipulation exposed, the meeting felt less like a trap and more like the final act of a play that had been 30 years in the making. We're not running, he said quietly, surprising Marcus and Sarah. Not this time. Daniel, please think about this rationally, Sarah pleaded. If these people have been orchestrating this whole thing, then they already know exactly where I am, what I'm doing, who I care about. He looked around the film, set with new eyes, seeing the vulnerabilities he'd been blind to. Running won't protect you. It'll just make you easier targets. The fog swirled between them, carrying the salt smell of the harbor and something else. Something that reminded Daniel of that night in the mountains, when the rain had turned the world into a weapon. He'd spent 3 decades believing Tommy had died because of his recklessness, his insistence on doing the stunt despite the weather. The guilt had shaped every choice since, every careful calculation designed to ensure no one else would pay the price for Daniel Way's ambition. But if Tommy had been murdered, if the crash had been orchestrated, then everything Daniel thought he knew about himself was a lie. Marcus. Daniel turned to his oldest friend, seeing the fear warring with loyalty in the man's weathered features. I need you to get the crew out of here. Sarah, too. Take them back to Hong Kong or Los Angeles, anywhere but Vancouver. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Marcus's voice carried 15 years of shared dangers, of trust built stunt by stunt. Whatever this isn't a film, Marcus. The safety nets aren't there. The falls aren't choreographed. Daniel gripped his friend's shoulder, feeling the solid reality of bone and muscle beneath his fingers. And if something happens to me, I need to know the people I care about are safe. Sarah stepped between them, her director's instincts taking over despite her fear. There has to be another way. We could call the police, explain what's happened. And tell them what? Daniel's laugh came out bitter. That a sick child recited my dead friend's words? That anonymous phone calls are connected to accidents from 30 years ago? They'd think I was having a breakdown. The film equipment around them, cameras, lights, the architecture of illusion, seemed to mock the conversation. Daniel had spent his career making impossible things look real, convincing audiences that one man could fight armies and survive falls that should kill him. But this was the opposite of movie magic. This was reality, refusing to follow any script he understood. His phone buzzed again. Another message. The child is awake. She's asking for you. Daniel showed the screen to Sarah and Marcus, watching their expressions shift from confusion to horror as they processed the implications. They're not done playing games, Sarah whispered. No, Daniel agreed. But neither am I. The decision crystallized in his mind with the clarity that had once made him Hong Kong's most fearless action star. For 30 years, he'd been reacting to circumstances beyond his control, letting guilt and grief drive his choices. But if Emma was truly just a pawn in someone else's game, if she'd been manipulated into delivering those devastating revelations, then she was as much a victim as Tommy had been. And Daniel Way had never been able to walk away from victims. I'm going to the hospital first, he said, his voice carrying the steel that had once made directors trust him with death-defying stunts. To see Emma, to understand exactly what they've done to her. Daniel, that could be exactly what they want, Marcus protested. Of course it is. Daniel pulled out his car keys, feeling the familiar weight of decisions settling over him. But they've made one critical mistake. They think they're still dealing with the broken man who walked away from that crash. The one who spent 30 years believing he'd killed his best friend. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing Vancouver's skyline in sharp detail. Daniel looked at the city with new eyes, seeing not just the backdrop for his final film, but the stage for a confrontation that had been building since that rain-soaked night in 1994. But I'm not that man anymore, he continued, meeting Marcus's concerned gaze. Because if Tommy was murdered, if all those other deaths were murders, then I've got nothing left to feel guilty about. And someone who isn't weighed down by guilt can be very, very dangerous. Sarah reached for his arm, but Daniel was already moving toward his car. Behind him, he heard Marcus organizing the crew evacuation with military efficiency, heard Sarah making calls to cancel the day's shoots. The film that was supposed to be his farewell to action cinema would remain unfinished. But maybe that was fitting, because Daniel Way wasn't retiring after all. He was going to war. Daniel's BMW cut through Vancouver traffic with surgical precision, muscle memory from countless chase scenes guiding him through lanes, while his mind raced ahead to the confrontation that had been 3 decades in the making. The hospital loomed before him like a concrete monument to all the lies he'd been fed. And for the first time since that rain-soaked night in 1994, he felt the familiar burn of controlled fury in his chest. The pediatric ward felt different now, not the sacred ground of a child's suffering, but a stage where he'd been manipulated with masterful precision. Daniel approached Emma's room with the predatory focus that had once made him Hong Kong's most dangerous screen fighter, every sense alert for the trap he knew was waiting. She was awake when he entered, sitting up in bed with an alertness that contradicted everything he'd been told about her condition. The monitors around her showed steady, strong vitals, not the erratic patterns of a dying child, but the rhythm of someone whose only performance was pretending to be sick. "Hello, Uncle Daniel," Emma said, and her voice carried none of the ethereal weakness from their previous encounter. This was the clear, confident tone of a child who'd been very well coached. "Hello, Emma." Daniel remained standing, studying her face with the intensity he'd once reserved for analyzing stunt choreography. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." She tilted her head, and for a moment her composure slipped enough to reveal something that made Daniel's blood freeze. Intelligence, calculation, the kind of sharp awareness that had nothing to do with childhood innocence. "The person who taught you about Tommy," Daniel said quietly. "They're here, aren't they?" Emma's smile was small and sad and completely wrong for an 11-year-old girl. "He's been waiting so long to see you again." The hospital room door clicked shut behind him, and Daniel turned to face the ghost that had been haunting him for 30 years. Dr. James Morrison stood framed in the doorway, but the name tag was a lie. Daniel would have recognized that face anywhere, even aged and weathered by 3 decades of careful planning. The same intelligent eyes that had once analyzed every stunt with mathematical precision. The same steady hands that had once signed off on equipment safety checks. The same hands that had sabotaged Tommy's car. "Hello, Daniel." The voice was older, refined by years in North America, but unmistakably familiar. "You look well. Success suits you." Richard. The name came out like a curse. Richard Kane, their unit safety coordinator, the man who'd been responsible for ensuring every stunt was executed without fatal consequences. The man Daniel had trusted completely, right up until the moment Tommy's car had left the mountain road. "Dr. Morrison now," Richard corrected gently, moving into the room with the careful steps of someone who'd spent years perfecting a false identity. "Pediatric oncology. I've found working with children to be quite rewarding. They're so much easier to direct than adult actors." Daniel's hands clenched into fists, the rage of 30 years crystallizing into something pure and focused. "You killed him." "I prevented a catastrophe." Richard's voice carried the same reasonable tone he'd used during safety briefings, as if explaining why a particular stunt needed modification. "Do you have any idea what Tommy discovered that week? What he was planning to reveal?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. In all his years of guilt and grief, he'd never considered that Tommy might have died for something more than just being Daniel's friend. "The insurance fraud," Richard continued, settling into the visitor's chair as if this were a pleasant social call. "Tommy found the pattern in the stunt accidents. 5 different productions. Millions in claims for equipment failures that were anything but accidental. He was going to expose everything." Emma watched the conversation like a tennis match, her young face reflecting none of the confusion a normal child would show at such revelations. Daniel realized with sickening clarity that she'd been present for planning sessions, had absorbed details about Tommy's death the way other children learned fairy tales. "So you murdered him to protect your scheme," Daniel said. "I eliminated a threat to preserve an operation that was funding independent films across 3 countries. Richard's composure never wavered. Tommy's investigation would have destroyed dozens of careers, hundreds of jobs. One man's life against an entire industry's future. The mathematics were quite clear. And the others, Wei Min, Lin Zhang, all the people who started asking questions. Loose ends." Richard shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discussing weather patterns. "Each one a potential unraveling of everything we'd built. Emma's performance was designed to gauge how much you'd actually remembered, how dangerous you might still be to our interests." Daniel looked at the child who'd channeled Tommy's voice with such devastating accuracy, seeing now the careful manipulation behind every whispered memory. She wasn't a victim, she was Richard's protégé, trained from birth to be the perfect weapon against Daniel's guilt. The hospital room felt like a tomb, sterile and white, and filled with 30 years of carefully orchestrated lies. But as Daniel faced the man who'd destroyed his life, he felt something he hadn't experienced since that night in the mountains: absolute clarity about who deserved to pay for Tommy's death. Daniel's clarity lasted exactly as long as it took him to realize he was holding Richard's future in his hands, and finding himself paralyzed by the weight of that responsibility. "You're wondering if you should kill me," Richard observed with clinical detachment, studying Daniel's expression like a researcher cataloging behavioral responses. "It would be justice, wouldn't it? An eye for an eye, Tommy's death finally avenged." The monitors around Emma's bed continued their steady electronic heartbeat, marking time in a room where 30 years of deception had finally collapsed into truth. Daniel found himself thinking not of revenge, but of Tommy's voice that last night. Not Emma's rehearsed mimicry, but the real memory of his friends' excitement about the film they were making, the stories they wanted to tell. "The police are already on their way," Daniel said quietly. "Marcus called them before I left the set." Richard's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment. "You always were more thoughtful than your characters suggested." "Tommy taught me that," Daniel replied. "He said the difference between a hero and a killer is knowing when to stop." Emma watched them both with eyes too old for her face, and Daniel felt a wave of genuine sadness for this child, who'd been weaponized before she was old enough to understand what she was becoming. Whatever Richard had done to shape her into his perfect instrument of manipulation, she was still just 11 years old, still salvageable if anyone cared enough to try. "What happens to her?" Daniel asked, nodding toward Emma. "That depends entirely on what story you choose to tell the authorities," Richard said. "Emma has family in Montreal, good people who believe she's been receiving experimental cancer treatment here. They could continue believing that if you were feeling generous." The offer hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Daniel understood the implicit bargain, Emma's innocence preserved in exchange for Richard's cooperation, for a clean resolution that wouldn't destroy a child who'd been as manipulated as Daniel himself. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Vancouver's morning fog was lifting outside the hospital windows, revealing the city in sharp, unforgiving detail. Daniel thought about all the films he'd made, all the stories where justice arrived with fists and explosions, and the satisfying simplicity of good defeating evil. Real life, he was learning, was far more complicated. "She deserves better than this," Daniel said, looking at Emma with something approaching compassion. "Better than being your puppet." "I gave her purpose," Richard replied. "Direction. Skills that will serve her well in whatever life she chooses." "You gave her nightmares she'll spend years unlearning," Daniel countered. "The ability to lie so convincingly that she'll never be sure when she's telling the truth." "You turned a child into a weapon, Richard. That's not purpose, that's abuse." The sirens were louder now, close enough that Daniel could hear the squeal of tires as police vehicles navigated the hospital's parking structure. Richard remained seated, his hands folded in his lap like a man who'd always known this moment would eventually arrive. "Tommy would have destroyed everything," he said, almost conversationally. "Not just the insurance operation, but the entire independent film ecosystem we'd built. Hundreds of artists whose careers depended on our funding. Was one man's life worth more than all those dreams?" Daniel found himself thinking of Sarah, of Marcus, of all the crew members who'd trusted him with their careers over the years. People who'd believed in the stories they were telling together, who'd found meaning in the collaborative act of creation. Richard wasn't wrong about the value of artistic dreams, but he was catastrophically wrong about the mathematics of murder. "Tommy's life wasn't a calculation," Daniel said. "He was my friend. He was someone's son, someone's brother." "He had dreams too, Richard. You just decided yours were more important." The door opened, and Vancouver police officers filed into the room with the careful efficiency of professionals who'd been briefed on the situation's complexity. Daniel recognized Detective Sarah Kim from the Missing Persons Unit. Marcus had chosen well in deciding who to trust with this story. Richard stood slowly, extending his hands for the handcuffs with the resigned dignity of a man who'd spent 30 years preparing for this moment. Emma watched from her hospital bed, and for the first time since Daniel had met her, she looked genuinely confused, a child trying to understand why her world was suddenly changing. "I'll take care of her," Detective Kim said quietly to Daniel, following his gaze. "We have social workers who specialize in cases like this. She'll get the help she needs." Daniel nodded, feeling something settle in his chest that he hadn't realized had been twisted in knots for decades. Not peace. The dead couldn't be brought back, the years of guilt couldn't be simply erased, but something approaching resolution. Tommy's real voice, not Emma's performance, seemed to whisper in his memory, sometimes the best stunt is knowing when not to jump. Outside, Vancouver was waking up to another ordinary day, full of people telling themselves stories about who they were and what they'd done to survive. Daniel Way had lived with one story for 30 years. Now he had to learn how to live with the truth. It felt like the hardest role he'd ever been asked to play.